All right. Hey, everybody. I'll give you guys a second to get settled down, and then I'll get started. But yeah, broadly, I'm Aryan Bhatt. I lead the high-stakes control team at Redwood Research. I've been thinking about and working on AI control for two and a half years now. Not as long as it gets, but pretty up there. And yeah, I think we've made quite a lot of progress since then, but there's still quite a long ways to go. And in my talk, I'm going to talk broadly about what I think the current state of the situation is, what the current state of affairs looks like in the world regarding high-stakes control, and what my plan is for how we should proceed, what our priorities should look like as a field and as a community to make things go well from now to the singularity. Great. So broadly, I'm going to talk first, like I said, about the current state of affairs. Then I'm going to talk about preparing for the future. And lastly, I'm going to give you guys my plan. Throughout this, I'm recurrently going to be referencing the dual notions of mitigation and evaluation. By this, just for reference, by mitigation, I mean mitigations that actually reduce risk from AIs that are colluding and conspiring against us. And by evaluation, I mean evaluations not just of the AIs themselves, but of risk overall. Evaluations of risk, evaluations of our current situation. This involves evaluations of the AIs, but also of the mitigations and also of, threat modeling, things like that. So, the current state of affairs in terms of especially mitigation and evaluation. Well, if we look at the current AI companies and their leading frontier AI companies and their plans, we have a reasonable number of mentions about AI control. Anthropic's RSP talks about both what their plans are as well as what they recommend for the industry. And on the mitigation side, they have their frontier safety roadmap where they describe, they lay out mitigations and techniques that might be necessary in order to, in the next few years, keep us safe. Within that, they have a bunch of control-flavored mitigations. They have a few different security and control-flavored milestones that they're trying to hit. And they also have a bunch of evaluation-related plans. Most notably, their risk reports and their third-party review. They, as you guys might be familiar, have published already a few different risk reports on the basis of their current models. And they plan to continue doing so. This is kind of archetypically what I mean by this sort of evaluation. If we look at GDM's frontier safety framework talks about residual risk assessments that they're going to write. They talk about how they're going to plan to have mitigations in order to reduce risk from loss of control from misalignment. In particular, they talk about limiting affordances, monitoring and escalation, auditing, and just generally a bunch of control-flavored mitigations. They also have this evaluation flavor of these control-flavored evaluations, including assessing the robustness of these mitigations. The original conception of AI control was as a conservative evaluation methodology to evaluate safety techniques, and I think that although there's been, some changes to that, broadly, it seems like we still have these like mitigations and evaluations in mind. OpenAI, in their preparedness framework, which is now a year old, but Dylan's here wherever he is, and I'm sure we can get some sort of updated information there. They talk about how they will write safeguards reports that compile, just like before, their mitigations and their evaluations of the state of affairs and of their mitigations. These also reference a bunch of control-related mitigations, and I think that, if you look at the actual actions the companies are taking, which we'll get to in a sec, you, get a little bit of a view of where we are so far on the mitigation and evaluation front. So, what do I say overall? Basically, it seems to me like the current situation in terms of AI companies and their plans is that they say they'll try to mitigate loss of control risk. They say that they'll implement mitigations, including control-style mitigations, in order to mitigate these risks. And they also say they'll evaluate their mitigations as well as their overall security posture and their overall level of risk imposed. To be fair, there's not particularly any mechanisms to ensure that these plans are going to be followed out or are going to be carried out or followed through on. But I think that, in the future, we might have things like regulation or norms or reasons to believe that these plans might, in fact, be followed through on. One thing you'll note is that there isn't much forward-looking text in these plans. They definitely do some amount of forward-looking work, but I think that especially in terms of concreteness of mitigations and evaluations, I think most things are pretty myopically focused. This is fine, this makes sense, but I think it's a thing to really keep in mind as we think about what should our plan be going forward into the future? How do we ensure that risk is low, not just right now, but also into the future? So let's look at what the companies have actually done, right? What is the current state of affairs in terms of what's actually been implemented, all this work that we've done, all these plans that we've written, what have they actually amounted to? Well, I think that, we can just look at the things that have been publicly talked about. Currently, we have a bunch of asynchronous monitoring, as people have spoken about a bunch at this conference. Multiple companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, publicly have asynchronous chain of thought-based monitors. The coverage varies across the AI companies, but broadly, these monitors are looking for things that might be related to loss of control risks. Currently, the way these work is that we have monitors that escalate to human review, perhaps with some AI assistance. And this is, the first step, I think, in control style mitigations. We also are starting to see some real-time monitoring, by which I mean monitors that run before an AI is even able to take their actions and potentially block those harmful actions from being executed. For example, Claude Auto Mode was recently released by Anthropic, which aims to do, implement a mitigation like this. We also have control relevant capability evaluations. So a lot of the work being done in the outside world, externally to the AI companies, is on building and developing control environments that allow us to evaluate monitors, policies, attackers, all kinds of things, in order to do this evaluation to understand what our current state of affairs looks like, how much risk there is imposed by the near-term models. So I'd say the current state of affairs is we have these monitors, we have asynchronous ones, we have real-time monitors, we have these capability evals. We also have, I think, things that are less often considered like core control measures, but I think really do actually add a bunch of value. For example, just standard cybersecurity measures, right? AI companies have, passwords on their computers and all kinds of other very reasonable mitigations, as long as lack of some other reasonable mitigations that make it harder potentially for a misaligned AI to take over. I think another thing that's underrated is the level of default human oversight that we currently have. This is, I think, a very important part of the current reason for assurance that misaligned AIs couldn't, do too much damage, is that humans just, generally notice what their Claude agents are doing. And even if you're not reviewing every line of code, which people aren't, it is, reasonably obvious at times when something goes horribly wrong, or if something is, eating up large amounts of resources that you don't notice or whatever. And I think this is a large part of today's actual security systems, really. We also starting to see some work on sandboxing and containment. Some of this is just to prevent reward hacking or prevent AIs from having consequences outside the bounds of their scope. But I think these measures are also incredibly relevant for AI control. And we're starting to see things like this crop up. So I think that overall, this is the current state of mitigation is looking, it's come a far way from a year or two ago. On the evaluation front, we have, different types of orgs doing different good work here. For the monitors that I just talked about, both the asynchronous and the real-time monitors, we have static evaluations of these things built by the outside world as well as internally at AI companies. We have static evaluations like Monitor Bench, where you just publish this and you get a final score out for how good a monitor is. We have automated red teaming tools. We also have human red teaming. Meter recently did their embedded red teaming exercise, where they had a human red team stress test Anthropic's internal control measures and monitors. And I think this is another great part of the evaluation framework that allows us to know how well our techniques are actually working. We also do a bunch of threat modeling, both within AI companies, for example, within these risk reports that I've referenced, and also externally at orgs like Redwood Research, Meter, etc. I think that this threat modeling is really, really important for understanding what the current level of risk is, because it's really hard to know how likely you are to get screwed if you don't know how you're getting screwed. We also are starting to see more public end-to-end evaluations of these types of things. We have, for example, Meter publishing their reports on the current state of monitoring and the current state of how good, AIs are at various long time horizons of tasks, as well as just directly stress testing things like monitoring systems. I do think that there isn't. One thing that we notably don't see is we don't have great public evals of security or containment measures, I think. Perhaps these things privately exist internally at AI companies, but publicly, I think there's not much, public state of knowledge on this. And we also don't have many evaluations of human oversight or even, any of the other more complex techniques I mentioned earlier. Things other than the static monitoring. So, we're at a good starting point. We're starting to evaluate these mitigations, but I think, once again, there is quite a ways to go here. broadly, I think that the place this leaves us in is that given the current state of mitigations, evaluations, just all that, I think that catastrophic risk in the near future, like for example in the next 6 months, is quite low. I think that we're not suffering large amounts of misalignment caused catastrophic risk in the near future, but this is mostly because current AIs just aren't capable enough, right? I think this is a reason for happiness and joy, of course, but also it does mean that we really, really, really need to actually actively prepare to ensure this in the future. I think that by default, it's not clear that the current techniques or the current evaluation frameworks or the current transparency measures or whatever will be sufficient in the future once AIs are capable enough to potentially be misaligned or potentially cause harm if they are misaligned. And so we really, really, really need to prepare for this stuff. I'm going to spend the next, few minutes of the talk talking about how can we prepare, right? And then I'll leave you off with my final overall potential plan for what our priorities as a field should be in order to be prepared for this. So, in particular, I think that one good question to ask in terms of how to be prepared to ensure this in the future is what is the future likely to look like, right? What is going to happen by default? What isn't going to happen by default? What are we on track to do versus not on track to do, right? I think it's the role of a field to continually assess this and make sure that they're on track to make the future risks also go well as the current risks. And so what are we on track to do? Well, I think that there's some things that will happen by default. And I think that's great. I think this is like a notable improvement from the state of affairs a year ago or 2 years ago. Things could have been much worse. I think that, for example, on the mitigation front, I think it's reasonably likely that we'll have monitoring systems like today's, but increasingly deployed with broader coverage, better improved monitors, etc. I think that this is reasonably likely to happen. I think that this is great, and this is in part due to the efforts of people here and people that aren't here, but are brethren in arms. But I think that just because it's due to our efforts, I think doesn't mean that the work is done. I think that this will happen by default, but it really, really, really requires people to continue to be on the ball here. I think also by default, it seems likely to me that we get other security and containment systems, right? Like I've been mentioning, sandboxing type measures, permission management frameworks, standard security measures for agent security, things like that, I think are reasonably likely to be implemented by default. And this is due to a combination of reasons. Some of them are because I think there's, normal corporate incentives for certain types of failures to be mitigated. I think also, your AIs are just a lot less useful if they're constantly breaking out of their sandboxes and doing things you didn't want them to do. And so I think there's, reasonable reason to believe that we'll, in fact, see these mitigations by default. I think in general, across the board, mitigations that are going to help with nearer term risks or risks that are more continuous in nature, right? Where we can see early precursors of them before we see later, more catastrophic or more dangerous versions, I think are likely to be more likely to be implemented by default. For example, I think that techniques that are, control techniques that are helpful for prompt injection or jailbreak robustness or reward hacking are more likely to be implemented by default. And this doesn't mean that we don't need to focus on them, but it does mean that I think we can prepare for a future where techniques like those are in fact implemented. Improving the implementation might still be, a good thing to do, but I think these are the things that I think we're on track to do. On the evaluation side of things, right? I think that we're probably going to be in a place where we'll have decent internal evaluations of the simple black box mitigations like the ones we have today, right? So if you look at just the methodologies we have today for evaluating monitoring systems, by simple black box mitigations, I mean things like monitors, maybe chain of thought monitors, like the ones we have today. I think that we're already starting to have reasonable evaluation methodologies for these things, and I think it's likely that we'll continue to improve on that regard. I, however, think that, a couple of load-bearing points here is simple and black box, as well as internal. I think that I'll get to those points in a second when I talk about what won't happen by default. But broadly, to make the scope clear here, I'm really just talking about the systems that we have today. I also think that we'll do a reasonable job at doing basic amounts of threat modeling. I think that we're already doing basic amounts of threat modeling, and I think it's great and incredibly helpful. And I think that we're going to continue to do so just via both, once again, the nonprofit space as well as internally at AI companies, preparedness and safety teams doing this kind of threat modeling in order to target their mitigations best. Now, what won't happen by default? I think this is more important for us to focus on. I don't want to, once again, make it seem like the things that will happen by default should just be taken for granted. It totally still is up in the air whether these things will happen, and it still is, in fact, the case that, it's still the case that, I'm bad at this. It's still the case that making these things happen but better or more effectively or more quickly or efficiently is still, in fact, a useful thing to do. But I think that it makes sense to really think about what we're not on track to do and figure out what we're going to change about the field in order to make this happen. I think that on the mitigation end, once again, I'm going to go by mitigation and evaluation. On the mitigation end, I think that development of techniques that are specifically tailored to scheming or colluding or conspiring AIs are less likely to happen by default. One of the reasons that I think this is just because, like I said earlier, I think that techniques that are more continuously useful are more likely to be, subject to the normal incentives of, our standard, economic structure. And I think that scheming is a risk that might be far more emergent or might be far more likely to emerge before we have like strong evidence for scheming or before we have like continuous risks that scale up to scheming smoothly. And so this makes it so that, when you have these kinds of step changes, it might be really hard for us to prepare ahead of time for techniques that are specifically tailored to schemers. I think that this includes techniques that, help deal with collusion, but also even just techniques with, if you've read the original AI control paper, a lot of the affordances we use are these, we assume access to these dumber trusted models. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which those techniques, despite being some of the oldest techniques in the control book, I think might not be implemented or developed or researched well enough by default, because this is the type of thing that's only useful really if you have potentially colluding AIs. Not only useful, but broadly speaking, more useful. I also think that generically across the board, preparation for quick or discontinuous loss of affordances that we're currently relying on might be a bit rough, right? So, for example, we currently have access to monitorable chains of thought. I think this is great, and we should certainly make use of this affordance. But I think that it's myopia hits hard, especially in cases like these. And if it's the case that one day we instantly lose access to monitorable chain of thought, or we instantly start, over the course of a day or a month or, a few months, start having large amounts of online training or continual learning, this might totally change the situation in a way which makes some of our control techniques totally obsolete, or maybe not obsolete, but they require a lot of adaptation. And I think this is the type of thing that we're not currently, it seems to me, on track to do by default. And so preparation for things like this, I think, are pretty important as well. On the evaluation side of things, I think that good public evaluations of these black box techniques don't seem certain to me to happen by default. I think right now I'm pretty pleasantly surprised by the state of affairs, but like I mentioned earlier, things can change, and it's definitely plausible that even though the current RSPs or FSFs or preparedness frameworks say that that systems will be subject to third-party review, I think it's very plausible that in the future they won't be. And I think ensuring that this continues to happen is really, really important for society to maintain their understanding of these risks, which is really important for us mitigating the risks. I think that in addition, any evaluation of non-black box techniques or like lower assurance techniques it doesn't seem to me like it's going to happen by default. I think it's really, really tough often to evaluate how well these techniques are working. One of the reasons that we do AI control research is, among many others, is that we notice that a difficulty with alignment research is that it's really, really hard to know how well your alignment techniques are working when you don't have, access to the scheming AIs that you're trying to apply them to. Similarly, with a lot of these lower assurance techniques, it's really, really unclear how well they're working. And so I think that we might be in a situation where for a long period of time, we're really relying on these techniques that, form the bulk of our mitigations, but that we don't really even know how to evaluate or don't know how good they are. I think this is also a scary state of affairs, and it's not going to be solved by default. I think this will require a good deal of science and a good deal of, novel R&D in order to alleviate. But I think it's definitely doable. I also think that more advanced threat modeling might not be done by default, especially for superhuman systems. I think that, threat modeling in the subhuman regime is a notably easier affair. In particular, it, I think, is much more analogous to normal human threat modeling for insider threats from humans or from other kinds of security threats. Whereas threat modeling for vastly superhuman systems might look radically different than any sort of threat modeling we've done before. And I think that we're not currently on track to, do a great job at this. Not, once again, for lack of trying necessarily, but just because it's a novel, hard task. And so I think it's really important that we're able to do this threat modeling to know, especially if we're trying to look into the future and prepare our techniques for the future, I think it's really important for us to know what these future systems might look like, what the new threats there might be, and how our techniques are likely to fall apart. So I think that this is, my current, that was a little bit of my assessment of, I'm not saying this is all the things, this is not meant to be fully exhaustive, but I think that these are some of the things that won't happen by default, and I think we need to keep an eye out on as a field in order to make sure that we are prepared to, tackle these challenges as they come up. Another thing I think we need to think about as a field in terms of the future is thinking about what's going to change over time, right? I think that there's a lot of things that it's not a matter of like happening by default or not happening by default. It's a matter of just the situation, the state of affairs might change, right? Such that we should reallocate our labor perhaps or do things totally differently. For example, we might have vast amounts of AI labor. This is a huge, huge, huge deal. And it might mean that if in the future we are, confident that we're going to have vast amounts of AI labor that we can use to implement certain control techniques or research certain control techniques, or even just use them within our control techniques or evaluations or whatever it is. I think that this is a really, really big affordance that we should really be thinking about. I think that another thing that we're going to have to deal with is the fact that we're generally going to be far more uncertain about the situation. Right now, if we set up processes that are great evaluation and transparency processes, but that take 3 months to, complete, this is well and good when we have, months between, large model releases. But if the situation is getting faster and faster and we're having any sort of intelligence explosion or recursive self-improvement type dynamics, it might be the case that in the future we have, every few weeks models being released, or eventually maybe every few days. And at that point, I think it's, going to be way, way, way more difficult to apply these techniques that we, developed for a 3-month regime. And so I think when you're living in this weird future world where there's less time between model releases, you have all kinds of, confusing things where a model gets deployed and then undeployed and then they hotfix a thing and then there's like, Claude 5.6.2.31 new, Sonnet old or whatever. It's going to, I think, be reasonably different in terms of the structures that we're going to need in order to assure that that risk is low. And so I think we should also think about being prepared for these, especially on the more policy facing and advocacy facing side. I also think that another thing that's under considered is that in the future, we might be pretty confident that our models are or aren't egregiously misaligned. If we are confident that our models are egregiously misaligned at any point, that totally changes the situation, right? I would love to see some amount of work. Of course, once again, you don't put all your eggs in one basket, but I think we should prepare for the possibility that we'll know our models are scheming and come up with some set of techniques, evaluation methodologies, etc., that are tailored to the situation where we know our models are scheming. What can we do there? I think the mitigations look very different, and I think that the processes also should look very different. Similarly, if we're confident that a certain level of model isn't egregiously misaligned, how can we use that affordance, right? I think this is a huge thing that could really make a big difference in both your techniques, your mitigations, as well as your evaluations. And we should really be prepared and have plans to know, hey, how are we going to adapt to this in the future? Lastly, I think there's this kind of, this isn't a catch-all term. There's always unknown unknowns, but I think that you might have brand new threat vectors crop up, right? You might have to deal with completely different types of threats that we're not currently dealing with because there's new economic forces at play, or there's new, crazy rapid developments in AI stuff, or the game board just completely changes in some way. And I think that if all of our mitigations are targeted towards specifically three frontier companies and these types of AIs at these companies and these types of control mitigations in particular, I think we might be not very resilient to large changes in these things. So once again, not saying that everybody should drop what they're doing and work on specifically novel threat vectors, but I do think that it's really important to think about how likely it is that we're going to have to make some drastic changes in this way. There we go. So overall, what's my plan, right? I think that I would like things to go well. I think that we can totally make things go well here. I think that at all points from now to the singularity, right? I would like us to ensure 3 things. I would like us to ensure 1, evaluation. That society has an accurate estimate of risk in the near future, right? This both entails, the society part, but also the accurate part, right? I think that it's hard to have both, broadly understood and accurate estimates of risk, but I think that's important. 2, we've implemented the mitigations necessary to make that estimate low. I think that this is also incredibly important. It's not enough to just know that your risk is high or know that your risk is whatever level it is. You also want it to be low, right? That's evaluation. 2nd is mitigation. And 3, preparation. I want us to prepare to assure items 1 and 2 in the future. I think that it's, once again, like I said, not by default going to be the case that everything that works today is going to work in the future. And it's really important to think things through in this way. So what do I think this is going to look like? What do I think it looks like for the field to come together and try to, ensure these priorities at all points from now till, I say the singularity, I mean, I'm going to keep kicking till we're down. I think that hopefully we won't be down, but I think that, I broadly just mean as long as we are in this current regime where we're able to do AI control. One, society has an accurate estimate of risk. What do I mean by this? I'm imagining a pretty short time period, like the next 6 months or so. This time period might get shorter over time as, if things are speeding up. But I would like to ensure that in the near term, we have an accurate estimate of risk at all points in time. What does this mean? This requires that companies keep publishing risk reports like the ones that they currently publish or don't publish. I think that it requires that outside organizations like Meter keep on, metering and doing their jobs. I think it's amazing that we have this public state of knowledge right now, and I think we need to both improve it because I think, at certain companies there isn't as much public knowledge, and also to maintain it. I think that merely maintenance is going to be quite hard because you're going to have increased economic pressures, increased competitive pressures, race dynamics that make it so that by default, I don't think this is very likely to happen, right? Like I said, the labs have their plans right now. The companies have their plans, but they currently seem fragile to me, and it's not at all clear, whether we have any teeth here. I also think it'd be great if we had a public state of science on this so that we had best practices for capability evaluations, control evaluations, threat modeling, all the evaluation stuff. I want it to be as transparent to the public and as not necessarily to lay people, but at the very least to the scientific community, have risks be as transparent and globally understood as possible. I also think, lastly, that in order to ensure this stuff, right, even if we have the science, we also need to actually get it out there to the world. I think we need transparency measures and ideally at some point even regulation to make sure that all these evaluation frameworks or these best practices that we're coming up with are in fact implemented and adopted. I think that this is, it is in fact a pretty large challenge, this thing overall. And I think that many, many, many different types of organizations in the space are going to need to come together to make this happen. But I think that we can totally do it. So this is the evaluation. Mitigation. What do I want? I want the developers to have implemented the mitigations necessary to make that estimate low. So, the obvious first thing here is that you need the AI companies to keep implementing control techniques. I think that, currently, like I said, we've come a long way in the last year or two. We need to keep going. We need to go further, and we need to go ideally faster. I think that the current types of techniques that are being implemented are good, but we also need new techniques. I think that this, can be done both at a combination of internally at AI companies as well as in the external safety community. I think that there's, differential advantages of doing things internally versus externally at companies. But I think that some of the work that needs to be done here in, having these techniques ready 2 years from now is developing them ahead of time. So on the mitigations front, I want companies to implement techniques. I want people to develop new techniques. And we might need at some point some amount of external pressure to get these techniques adopted. Lastly, I think a thing that's a bit stated just on the current margin is the fact that, the deployments that I care about by far the most are, I think, internal deployments at AGI companies, but they're not the only ones that matter. I think that most deployments within the world are far less likely to be catastrophic, but I think there's a couple of other high-stakes external deployments, for example, within high-stakes decision-making in the US government or within the US military, and I think those might also need to be secured and controlled, right? And so there's also a matter of not just developing these techniques at AI companies, but getting them implemented within other high-stakes deployments as well. And then lastly, preparation. Prepare to ensure 1 and 2 in the future. I think this is the place where we are currently the farthest behind. I think that we really need to target problems that won't be solved by default. This doesn't mean that, once again, that we can ignore the problems that might be solved by default, but I really think that right now on the margin, I think there's not enough thinking and effort put towards targeting problems that might not be solved by default. I also think that we should, at all points in time as a field, view it as our job to identify when and why our current techniques are going to fail, right? When our current mitigations, our current evaluation methodologies, all that, what is the current status of things and how likely is it to fail in the future? We should prepare for these eventualities because I think if we're caught flat-footed, it's fine when we have 3 months to fix our mistakes. It's not going to be as fine if and when things are much faster and higher stakes. And then lastly, I think we should prepare for changes that we can foresee. I think that, if in general, we're starting to be at a point where we're close enough to potentially transformative AI systems that I think we can foresee a lot of changes. I'm not saying that you can predict things with 100% accuracy, of course, but I think that there's a lot of changes that I think are reasonably predictable, and I think we should be ready to prepare for. All right. Well, regardless, my last slide was merely a leave off. I think that overall, like I said, my plan, I would say, is best summarized as evaluate, mitigate, prepare. I think that we as a field need to evaluate the current state of risk at all points in time, mitigate the current state of risk at all points in time, and then prepare to do so in the future. I think this is a doable task. I think that, it's not easy. It's not going to happen by default, but I think the field of control has come quite a long way from, 2 people talking about this in, at Redwood Research in some room to, hundreds of people here at ControlConf. And I think we can go a long ways further. I think that if we come together, we totally can do this, but I think we need to be mindful about it. And I think that, I don't know, you guys are totally capable of doing this. I believe in all of us. Yay. Thanks.